without further ado, I'm going to introduce Anthony Martinez, whose mentor is Dr. Jessica Boyette Davis. And Anthony will be presenting on You're Too Emotional, but so is everyone else, a review of the development of emotional intelligence during adolescence. Anthony, take it away whenever you're ready.
Alrighty. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Davis, for being here as well. So, like was introduced, I'm going to be talking about research into the development of emotional intelligence. And I know that anytime we bring up the idea of emotions, it can kind of start to get uncomfortable depending on how comfortable you are with emotions. But I would venture to say that if emotions do make you uncomfortable, you're just that much more aware of emotions and being able to identify them, especially the ones that you want to avoid. So before we get into anything, looking around the room, I see lots of different emotions on people's faces. Some people are a little bit confused. Some people were encouraged to be here to get extra credit. Other people were encouraged to be here because they're my friends. But I would ask you guys to take a look at all of the faces on the screen, and I think we could all agree, at least on a few of them, of what it is that they're feeling, right? I think we could all agree that the gentleman in the top right is probably happy. The guy next to him, probably not so happy. And then if we take a look at the two people at the bottom, expressively, they're very similar, right? Raised brows, forehead lines, mouths open, but I think we'd agree that the gentleman probably looks scared, and the lady is shocked, right? So despite the facial feature or the facial expression being similar, we can still discern what it is that they are conveying with their face, right? Now, it does take a degree of intelligence to identify what it is that's going on there. It's different than the intelligence that is measured whenever we take an IQ test. I don't know what's going on there. But if any of you can figure it out, we can talk after. Or being able to figure out what's right there. The answer's 7, but all of that said, what I'm getting at is that there's a difference between what we understand to be IQ, or the intelligence quotient, and what I'll get to, which is going to be emotional intelligence. When we talk about IQ, I think that's the most generally understood whenever we talk about metrics for intelligence. But within the last few years, really since the 90s, I'll say, there's been a shift away from using IQ as a metric for a number of reasons. One being the narrowness of IQ. I have up there kind of the aspects of intelligence that are measured whenever we talk about IQ. I'll get into a little bit later what is missing and why we say this is narrow. But beyond that, there's also a cultural bias in who was measured whenever we're talking about IQ, right? And as we become more diverse and we want to have studies that are reflective of more than just a certain subsection of people, we start to move away from these, I don't want to say narrow-minded, right? It's dated. We're moving forward in time and things are becoming a lot more diverse. And that takes us into EQ, right? When we talk about emotional intelligence, things become a little bit different, right? I'm not talking about your ability to solve a math problem. The aspects that we're analyzing are more about emotional awareness, empathy, social skills, and adaptability. And this comes from a book aptly named Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman from 1995, where he laid the foundation for this idea, right? Obviously, emotions weren't invented in 1995, but this idea of taking a look at intelligence from a perspective of emotions comes from around this time. And then from that, I'll get into a little bit later, but developing out of that research and kind of a little bit more modern is going to be social emotional processing, what that looks like when we take those ideas of emotional intelligence and adapt them to social environments. So taking a bit of a step back, now that we are all on the same page of what it is that we're talking about, something that I wanted to take into account when I was going through my research were the social implications. And oftentimes what that means is the impact that an individual can have on the world around them, right, their community. But I kind of wanted to look at the inverse of that and understand the pressures that the world might have on the individual, right? And that was sort of the influencing factor that led me to do this research. So between 2007 and 2021, there was a 67% increase in the suicide rate between ages 15 to 24. And it's really disheartening to hear that, right? These are the people, the youngest among us, and one of the leading causes of death for them is suicide. A big part of the reason that I wanted to do this research is because of this data. The reason being is that emotional intelligence, the capacity to believe in yourself, that self-efficacy, is a protective factor against a lot of these negative pressures that we experience and that I think are increasing as we become just more connected, right? I can talk to someone across the world like that, whereas a few years ago it wasn't really possible. So just kind of recapping the definition that we're talking about when we're talking about emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, interpret one's own emotions, and to engage effectively with others by understanding their emotions and the social dynamics involved, right? So being able to understand my own emotions, the consequences of that, being able to interpret someone else's emotions, and what that means for how we're going to interact moving forward, right? I'm going to interact differently with someone if they're having a bad day versus if they're having a good day, right? These are things that we generally understand, but how can we put those in a way, or how can we put that in a format that we can deliver it in an evidence-based way, right? So I have there at the bottom, obviously, the whole reason, or the exigence for the research is the protective factor against suicidal behavior, particularly amongst adolescents. Right alongside that is victimization and school bullying, which is closely tied with suicidal ideation, right? Students that are victims of bullying are more susceptible to suicidal ideation. And just general risk behaviors that are associated with later life, later life issues, right? Whether it be substance use or even those same pressures that we might experience earlier on. How do we facilitate this development? So obviously that's the big question, right? I think it's obvious that it's a valuable skill set to be able to modulate your own emotions and interpret the emotions of other people, not only for your own social benefit, but to be there for others as well, right? So I struggled for a while moving forward in the research, figuring out what it is that I wanted to offer, right? It's one thing to take a look at the research that's available. It's another thing to be able to articulate that in a way that offers a way forward and lays the foundation for future research. So what was really interesting to me, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, is that in 2023, the Texas Education Code was updated to include what they call social emotional learning. And within that, there's an emphasis on primary school, particularly within social interaction, right? So prioritizing students' ability to interact with their classmates. However, what was missing from the code is any curriculum to implement, right? At that point, despite it saying it's mandated, there's no suggestion as to what a teacher should do within the classroom. And ultimately, it would fall on the teacher to fill in that gap, right? So starting from the very top, social emotional learning, essentially just encouraging the emotional development in the classroom, right? We're taking a step away from, or a step beyond just emotional intelligence, and now how are we going to actually implement that into the classroom setting? Curriculum-wise, obviously it's the process by which we're trying to develop those competencies in K through 12, but the focus is mainly in, or the focus of the research was mainly in elementary school and middle school students. The goal being to improve the overall social and emotional well-being of the students. But getting into actual implementation, once I had the groundwork for what it is that I wanted to do, I reached out to a lot of different public schools in the area. And after being passed around a few times to a few different people, I started to realize that there wasn't really any curriculum that they were looking to implement district-wide, right? And even school-wide, when I would speak to counselors, there was nothing that was being implemented aside from classroom to classroom, and it fell on the teacher to sort of figure out what it is that was best for their students, right? And we're talking about being as efficient as possible and doing it in a way that's evidence-based. We are putting a lot of stress on an already stressful position when we ask them to essentially do the job of a professional, right? A professional in a different way. At the same time, I came across what's called a learner-centered approach, which is essentially the teacher is facilitating the learning environment, but the students are leading the learning. They take a peer-to-peer approach where they are looking to solve problems, answer questions, and the idea of them getting something wrong or coming across something that's difficult isn't the time where a teacher comes in to answer that question, right? It's a time where they're directed to their peers, they're directed to resources, where they can start to solve these questions on their own, persevering despite coming across that difficulty. What was very interesting is I was able to sort of take a step back from this narrowed-in view that I had access to because one of the students that I teach, she's part of one of the schools that do this learner-led approach. But I came across research looking into aversive learning. And in this specific situation, aversive learning is talking about an instance where a student is coming across any sort of adversity, right? And when I say adversity, I don't mean they're being bullied or anything like that, but essentially coming across something that they can't solve, right? And if they can't solve the problem, it's not that they're given the answer, but they're given the resources to find the answer. Research that cites aversive learning also takes a look at developmental variants, particularly of the amygdala. So when I'm talking about the amygdala, that's just going to be the part of the brain that is specific to social cognition and we would say emotional regulation, right? So obviously very important things whenever we're talking about emotional intelligence. And what I thought was very interesting, and we'll sort of set up the next slide, is how this has a lot of potential moving forward for research to take a look at what it is that we can do to take advantage of this period of time and really maximize the plasticity of the brain. Dr. Goldie shared some research with us in class that actually helped start my brain going in this direction, where she included a study that I have this diagram from that talks about adversity early in childhood, not particularly aversive learning, but it had me thinking in that direction. It's how I found a lot of the research that was from the previous slide. But talking about how young kids who had gone through adverse situations growing up had shown increased connectivity in this portion of the brain, which, because of the research I was doing, sort of brought me to the idea of, okay, well, if this is happening in conditions that are not the best, we'll put it that way, how can we redirect this in a positive way and use this research for something that's actually going to make the best out of a bad situation? So what does this all mean? I think the biggest thing that I think we should take away is how can we develop resilience in general. I was going to say resilient children, but we should all be resilient. This is something that I talked about with Dr. Davis, is just how everything is pointing in the same direction of supporting the development of resilience. And I think that's the bigger picture beyond just emotional intelligence or the social emotional learning. But it was hard for me to get over the 67%. And anything that we can do to help lower that number or make that that trend line go down, I think is very valuable. And rather than just saying, or rather than checking a box, this is what I'm supposed to do, I think it's important that we actually take an evidence-based approach and solve issues that I think are right in front of our face. So bringing it a little bit current. So the social isolation and brain, the effects and mechanism, this was a study that took a look at what we colloquially might call COVID kids, students or kids that were raised in the time of COVID, where essentially their early development was limited to social isolation, right? Unless they had siblings, and even then that's limited, right? So there's a lot of space to take advantage of the time that we have, especially with the kids that have had or missed out on the opportunity to interact socially in the way that a lot of us had the opportunity to growing up. And things are only going to continue to move in that direction. We might not be isolated due to COVID, but so much of what we do takes place online now. And it's very easy to, I won't say hide, but it's very easy to stay behind a screen rather than taking a look at people face to face. And you lose that social interaction that's so valuable to the development of emotional intelligence, and that's so valuable to take advantage of, especially early on. So it becomes that much more critical in the classroom setting to be able to use that time wisely. But I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Davis, who really, outside of the research, was a really big support and just helping to remind me that everything's going to be okay, and reminding me to prioritize myself, and the research will always be there, but it's important to make sure that I'm okay as well. Thank you to Dr. Wolk, who she's in the other room, and to the honors program for the honors grant that I was awarded. Professor Dina, thank you. She's not here, but she helped quite a bit with the presentation, and my family and friends, those of you that are here. Now I'll open it up to any questions.
Exactly.
Yes.
What aspect of the research did you, find that was most surprising for you?
I kind of took it in sections. So I think at the beginning, when I was sort of trying to figure out a why, because I think it's important to have a why if I'm going to spend a year's time committed to something. So I met with a lot of different professors because I wanted to see if what I wanted to do was even feasible. And I got a lot of good feedback, and that's actually how I found out about the Texas Education Code being updated in 2023 to include social emotional learning. I was genuinely surprised by that, just because it's, especially within the last few years, just the idea of altering a school's curriculum, especially public schools' curriculum in any way is kind of a little bit taboo, right? Especially whenever you start to use, I think, more modern language like social emotional learning. Those words alone don't really mean anything, right? Especially without examples coming behind it. So I could see how people would be against it, not necessarily knowing what it means. But I mean, it's awesome that it's part of the education code. Less awesome that there's not really anything that is being offered to teachers to implement in the classroom. But yeah. Yes, in the gray sweater. I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry. Within the article? Yes. Within the article, no. It wasn't a longitudinal study. They were just taking a look at students, comparing data that was previously collected from, I believe it was 2016, and then the study was taking a look at students that I believe had a year and a half worth time of isolation. But towards the end of the study, it laid a few questions for future research to take a look at possible solutions, but they didn't hypothesize any solutions. Yes?
Are there any schools that you came across that use the learner-led method that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I mentioned when I was presenting that one of the students that I teach, she goes to a school, they're called Acton Academy. They're a private school, which sort of introduces like another confound, because one is access, right? It's like who has access to private schools, and then two, the difference in the way that someone's life that goes to private school versus someone that goes to public school, and what that might look like. But it was interesting to me nonetheless, and I actually got to meet with the founders, the Sandefers. They have schools all over the world, which I thought was pretty interesting. I got to visit two, one that was elementary and middle school, and then their main campus, which is actually here in Austin. I got to visit that one. Very interesting, but I will say that I think what works for Acton may not work for public schools at large, because these schools have less than 100 students. They don't call them classrooms, they call them learning rooms, because they'll have like essentially a bedroom's worth of space for 7 kids, and that'll be an entire grade's worth of kids. So it's different, but I thought it was very interesting. And that sort of led me in the direction of taking a look at aversive learning research. So while Acton's method might not be for every school, I definitely think what they're doing is very valuable. And we can take a look at that to see what we can do at large. Yes?
I'm curious if you saw any overlap between the research that you did and research about maybe like students who are neurodivergent, if there's overlap there.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit with Dr. Davis about this ahead of the presentation, just talking about how this might look with students that have autism. So we talk about, at the very beginning of the presentation, we took a look at a few different faces, and the capacity to interpret emotions from faces requires partly being able to make eye contact, right? And when that's a difficult thing to do, it makes it that much more difficult to start to interpret those emotions. And a lot of what we take in terms of our emotional intelligence and our ability to discern emotions is through experience. So if early on our experience is thwarted for whatever reason, right, and whether that be autism or for any other reason, we can start to see those delays. And I think we see that in the research that is being done with autism. But I'd be very curious to see how the student-led approach works with students with neurodivergence, right? I know that Acton doesn't necessarily have, one, the resources, but two, they don't have classrooms that are suited for students that are neurodivergent. And they're very upfront about that, but I'd be curious to see research done related to that.
Such a great job. Let's give Anthony a round. To say a few words and stolen court, Anthony.
Let's see. So first is I've mentored, I don't know how many students through honors and McNair and all kinds of things, and I've got to say of all of the students I've ever worked with, Anthony's by far the most industrious, and just I never had to ask about anything. I just knew it was going to be taken care of. Hardworking, no doubt, very bright future. You can see how well he presented. Outstanding, right?
Yeah.
He's very, very confident, very even killed, amazing. So it was just really a joy to get to work with Anthony, and I'm so glad that he allowed me to be a part of this process. This is not like my area, and so he graciously educated me on some concepts that I wasn't all that familiar with. So yeah, anyway, just really happy to be a part of this, and thank Anthony for letting me be.